A struggling artist shared her lunch with a homeless man who turned out to be an art collector. The universe works in mysterious ways, Eliza thought, as she stared at the half-empty sandwich in her trembling hands. She never could have imagined that the simple act of sharing her meager lunch would change everything. The chill of early November seeped through Eliza Morgan's thin coat as she hurried down the crowded street, her portfolio case bumping against her leg with each hurried step. Another rejection. The 5th this month. The gallery owner had barely glanced at her paintings before dismissing them with a wave of his manicured hand. Too raw, he'd said. Too honest. The market wants something. Prettier. The word echoed in her mind like an accusation. Her stomach growled, a harsh reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's dinner, a pitiful bowl of instant ramen that had done little to quiet her hunger. The $20 bill tucked in her wallet was meant to last until the end of the week, but the gnawing emptiness in her belly won out. She ducked into a small deli, purchasing a turkey sandwich that cost nearly half of what she had left. Finding an empty bench in the small park, Eliza sat down, her shoulders hunched against the wind. The first bite of sandwich brought immediate relief, but did nothing to ease the heaviness in her chest. 3 years in New York, and what did she have to show for it? A cramped studio apartment with a leaking ceiling, a dwindling bank account, and a collection of paintings that nobody wanted to buy. She was so lost in her thoughts that she nearly missed the man sitting on the ground nearby. He was leaning against the trunk of a bare oak tree, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a gray beard streaked with silver. His clothes were worn but surprisingly clean, and there was something about the way he gazed at the fallen leaves that caught her attention. He wasn't looking at them so much as studying them, as if each crinkled brown leaf held some profound secret. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Eliza quickly looked away, focusing intently on her sandwich. But she couldn't ignore the quiet dignity in the man's gaze, couldn't pretend she hadn't noticed the way his hands, artist's hands, she realized with a start, were reddened from the cold. Before she could second-guess herself, Eliza broke her sandwich in half and stood up. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Would you like half?" "It's turkey and Swiss." He looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might wave her away with the same dismissive gesture she'd received countless times from gallery owners. Instead, he smiled, a gentle curving of lips that transformed his entire face. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth and clarity. "Thank you." Eliza handed him the sandwich half, surprised by the momentary brush of his fingers against hers. They were cold, yes, but also steady. Not the trembling hands she'd expected. An awkward silence stretched between them as the man took a careful bite of the sandwich. Eliza hovered uncertainly, torn between returning to her bench and staying. Something about him, perhaps the thoughtful way he ate, savoring each bite, or the intelligence in his deep-set eyes, made her curious. "I'm Eliza," she said finally, gesturing to the space beside him. "Mind if I join you?" "Please," he said, shifting slightly to make room. "I'm Thomas Harrington." Eliza lowered herself to the ground, ignoring the chill that immediately seeped through her thin pants. Up close, she noticed the fine lines around his eyes, laugh lines, her mother would have called them, and the careful way he held himself as if conserving energy. "Are you an artist?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Thomas paused mid-bite, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "What makes you ask that?" Eliza gestured to his hands. "Your hands, the way you look at things. Like you're really seeing them, not just looking." A smile touched his lips again, more pronounced this time. "I was. A lifetime ago." He took another bite of the sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "And you? That's a portfolio case, isn't it?" Eliza glanced down at the black case propped against her leg. "Yes. I paint. Or try to, anyway." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "Nobody seems interested, though." "May I?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the portfolio. Under normal circumstances, Eliza would have refused. After a morning of rejection, the thought of another dismissal, even from a stranger in a park, was almost unbearable. But something about Thomas's genuine interest, the way he'd noticed her portfolio when most people wouldn't have given it a second glance, made her nod. With careful movements, Thomas wiped his hands on a clean handkerchief he produced from his pocket, another surprise, before accepting the portfolio. His hands moved with practiced ease as he unzipped it and gently removed the canvas prints inside. The silence that followed as he examined her work stretched Eliza's nerves to the breaking point. She found herself holding her breath, watching his face for any sign of the disappointment she'd grown accustomed to seeing. But Thomas's expression was one of deep concentration, his eyes moving slowly across each piece, taking in every detail. He spent several minutes on each painting, occasionally tilting them to catch different angles of light. "You paint from the inside out," he said finally, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "These aren't just images, they're emotions made visible." Something warm unfurled in Eliza's chest, a feeling so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it as hope. "The galleries don't think so," she said, trying to temper the sudden lift in her spirits. "According to them, my work is too raw, too honest." "Too raw?" Thomas chuckled, a deep, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the chilly air. "Since when is honesty a liability in art?" He carefully returned the prints to her portfolio. "The problem isn't your work, Eliza. It's that you're showing it to the wrong people." The conviction in his voice made her want to believe him, made her wonder, for the first time in months, if perhaps her art wasn't the failure she'd begun to think it was. They talked until the sandwich was long gone and the afternoon light began to fade. Thomas spoke about art with a knowledge and passion that surprised her, discussing techniques and artists with an ease that suggested far more than a casual interest. Eliza found herself opening up about her struggles, her dreams, the childhood in rural Pennsylvania where she'd first discovered her love of painting. As dusk settled over the park, Eliza realized with a start how long they'd been talking. The temperature had dropped further, and she couldn't ignore the way Thomas occasionally rubbed his hands together for warmth. "I should go," she said reluctantly, gathering her portfolio. "It's getting cold." "Yes, I suppose it is." Thomas looked around, as if just noticing the deepening shadows. "Thank you for the sandwich, Eliza. And the conversation. Both were more nourishing than you know." The formal phrasing made her smile. "Where will you go?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't her place to pry. "Oh, I have my places," Thomas said vaguely, his gaze drifting to the darkening sky. "Don't worry about me." But she did worry, and the thought of him spending the night in the cold gnawed at her as she stood to leave. She had so little to offer, her own situation was precarious at best, but the idea of walking away felt wrong. "Thomas," she said, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke, "I live nearby. It's not much, but I have a couch. And heat." She swallowed hard, surprised by her own boldness. "If you need a place to stay tonight." The silence that followed her offer seemed to stretch into infinity. Thomas studied her face with an unreadable expression, and for a moment Eliza was certain she'd overstepped, had somehow insulted him. "That's a generous offer from someone who has little to spare," he said finally. "Are you sure?" No, she wasn't sure. Inviting a stranger home went against every safety rule she'd ever learned. But something about Thomas, the gentleness in his eyes, the respect with which he'd handled her art, the intelligence behind his words, made her nod. "I'm sure." Thomas's small apartment was exactly as she'd described it. Not much. A single room with a kitchenette in one corner, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a sagging couch that had been left by the previous tenant. The ceiling above the kitchen sink had a water stain that resembled a map of some imaginary continent, and the radiator clanked and hissed in irregular intervals. But it was warm and dry, and as Thomas stepped inside, Eliza saw it through his eyes. The stacks of books beside her bed, the easel by the window, the walls covered with her paintings, the ones too personal to show to galleries, the ones she created purely for herself. "May I?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the paintings. Eliza nodded, suddenly shy. These works were different from the ones in her portfolio, more experimental, more emotionally raw. She watched nervously as Thomas moved slowly around the small space, studying each canvas with the same intensity he'd shown in the park. He stopped in front of a large piece that dominated the wall above her bed, a swirl of deep blues and purples with a small burst of golden light at its center. It was the first painting she'd created after moving to New York, a visual representation of how small and lost she'd felt in the vast, indifferent city. "This one," Thomas said softly, "this one speaks." Something about the reverence in his voice broke open a sealed chamber in Eliza's heart. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and turned away quickly, busying herself with making tea. "The couch is all yours," she said, keeping her voice light. "I don't have much food, but we can share what I have." They ate a simple meal of canned soup and slightly stale bread, seated cross-legged on the floor because Eliza only had one chair. Thomas told stories about artists he'd known, speaking of them with such familiarity that Eliza wondered again about his past. But each time she tried to ask directly, he gently steered the conversation elsewhere. As the evening wore on, Eliza found herself relaxing, laughing more than she had in months. There was something liberating about talking to someone who seemed to truly see her work, truly understand what she was trying to express through her art. "Why do you live like this?" she asked finally, curiosity overcoming politeness. "You know so much about art, about technique. You could be teaching or working in a gallery." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the opposite wall. "Life takes unexpected turns," he said finally. "Sometimes we lose our way. Sometimes we choose to step off the path." The cryptic answer only deepened Eliza's curiosity, but she recognized the gentle deflection for what it was. Everyone had their secrets, their private sorrows. She of all people should respect that. Later, as she lay in bed listening to Thomas's soft, even breathing from the couch, Eliza found herself wondering about the strange twist of fate that had brought him into her life. A simple act of sharing food had somehow gifted her with the first person in years who truly seemed to understand her art. It was, she thought as sleep claimed her, like something from one of those inspirational videos her mother was always sharing on social media, heartwarming stories of coincidence and kindness that Eliza had always dismissed as too contrived to be real. Yet here she was, living one. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and the smell of coffee. Eliza blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unusual scent in her apartment. She rarely indulged in coffee. It was an expense she couldn't justify. She sat up to find Thomas standing at her tiny kitchen counter, carefully pouring hot water through a makeshift filter he'd created from paper towels. 2 chipped mugs waited on the counter, and beside them was a small paper bag from the bakery down the street. "You're awake," he said, glancing over with a smile. "I hope you don't mind. I went out early and got us breakfast." Eliza stared at him, confusion washing over her. "But how?" Thomas's smile turned slightly mischievous. "I'm not entirely without resources," he said, bringing a mug to her. "Just temporarily displaced." The coffee was rich and fragrant, clearly several steps above the instant packets Eliza bought when she could afford them. The paper bag contained 2 fresh croissants, still warm from the bakery's ovens. Such a simple breakfast, yet it felt luxurious, decadent even. "Thank you," she said, cradling the mug between her hands, savoring its warmth. "But you shouldn't have spent money on me. You gave me shelter," Thomas replied simply. "And conversation. Both priceless." They ate in companionable silence, watching the morning light strengthen across the floor. Eliza had nowhere to be, no galleries to visit, no jobs to rush to. Her part-time position at the cafe didn't start until the afternoon. The realization brought both relief and a familiar anxiety about her precarious finances. "What will you do today?" she asked, brushing croissant crumbs from her lap. Thomas seemed to consider the question carefully. "I thought perhaps if you're willing, you might show me more of your work? The pieces you don't include in your portfolio." The request caught Eliza off guard. Those paintings, stored under her bed, stacked in the closet, rolled up in tubes, were her heart laid bare on canvas. Works too personal, too emotionally exposing to show to the cold, critical eyes of gallery owners. "They're not finished," she said weakly. "Art is never truly finished," Thomas replied. "Only abandoned, as Da Vinci said." The casual reference to Da Vinci reminded Eliza again that Thomas was no ordinary homeless man. His knowledge of art was too extensive, too nuanced. Curiosity battled with vulnerability as Eliza considered his request. Finally, she nodded, slipping out of bed and padding to the closet in her socked feet. One by one, she brought out canvases, unrolled tubes, each one a piece of herself she'd hidden away. Thomas received each one with reverence, laying them carefully across the floor, the couch, propping them against walls until the small apartment became an impromptu gallery. He said little as he examined them, occasionally asking questions about a particular technique or color choice. It was the most exposed Eliza had felt in years, watching someone absorb works she'd created in moments of profound emotion, grief, joy, longing, fear. Yet Thomas's respectful appreciation made the vulnerability bearable, even transformative. "These," he said finally, gesturing to the paintings surrounding them, These are what galleries should be showing. This is work that matters. Eliza shook her head. They're too personal. Too honest. Thomas finished for her. Yes, that's precisely their value. He picked up a small canvas depicting a solitary figure standing at the edge of a stylized abyss. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, as Banksy put it. Your work does both. The praise warmed her, even as doubt crept in. That's a lovely sentiment, but it doesn't pay the rent. Thomas's expression turned thoughtful. Perhaps. He carefully set the painting down. But I believe there's a place for your work, Eliza. A place where it will be valued for exactly what it is. And where's that? The question came out more sharply than she'd intended, edged with the frustration of too many rejections. I might be able to help with that, Thomas said carefully. I still have connections in the art world. Eliza laughed, a short, hollow sound. No offense, Thomas, but... She gestured vaguely, encompassing his worn clothes, his evident homelessness. Appearances can be deceiving, he said quietly. And circumstances change. Mine have been complicated lately. The cryptic response piqued Eliza's curiosity again. Who are you, really? She asked. You know so much about art. You speak about painters like they're old friends, yet here I am, accepting the hospitality of a kind stranger. Thomas finished for her. His smile held a hint of sadness. It's a long story, Eliza. One perhaps better saved for another time. Under normal circumstances, Eliza might have pressed further. But there was something in Thomas's expression that made her hold back, a vulnerability that echoed her own. Okay, she said simply. Another time. They spent the rest of the morning talking about art while Eliza prepared for her shift at the cafe. Thomas helped her return the paintings to their hiding places, handling each one with a care that made something in her chest tighten. As she prepared to leave for work, Eliza hesitated by the door. You can stay, she found herself saying. If you want. I won't be back until evening. The offer surprised them both. Thomas regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Something that might have been gratitude or perhaps even remorse. That's very trusting of you, he said carefully. Eliza shrugged, suddenly embarrassed. I don't have anything worth stealing, she said with an attempt at lightness. Unless you've developed a taste for ramen noodles and canned soup. Thomas laughed, the sound warming the small apartment. I've had worse, he admitted. But Eliza, his expression grew serious. Thank you. Not just for the shelter, but for sharing your art. Your trust honors me. The formal phrasing struck her again, so at odds with his apparent circumstances. But Eliza merely nodded, suddenly shy, and slipped out the door. Her shift at the cafe passed in a blur of coffee orders and customer interactions, her mind frequently drifting back to her apartment and its unusual guest. Had she been foolish to leave a stranger alone in her home? Yet something about Thomas inspired trust, a feeling that whatever mysteries surrounded him, malice wasn't among them. By the time she returned home, evening had settled over the city. Eliza climbed the 4 flights to her apartment with weary legs, balancing a small container of leftover pastries the cafe manager had allowed her to take home. She was halfway up the final flight when she noticed the light spilling from beneath her door, brighter than the single lamp she usually left on. Pausing, she listened, heart suddenly racing. Voices. Multiple voices came from inside her apartment. For a wild moment, Eliza considered retreating, perhaps calling the building's superintendent, but curiosity won out over caution. She approached slowly, key in hand, and unlocked the door. The scene that greeted her was so unexpected that Eliza froze in the doorway, struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Her small apartment was filled with people, well-dressed people, holding wine glasses, gathered in small clusters, all seemingly engaged in animated conversation. And covering every available wall space were her paintings, not just the ones she'd shown Thomas that morning, but all of them, displayed with professional precision, strategically lit by portable spotlights she'd never seen before. In the center of it all stood Thomas, but not the Thomas she'd left that morning. This Thomas wore an impeccably tailored suit that transformed his entire bearing. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back, and the weathered look that had aged him had somehow diminished, revealing a handsome man in his late 50s. The room fell silent as heads turned toward her. Eliza remained frozen in the doorway, the container of pastries clutched against her chest like a shield. Ah, here she is, Thomas said, his voice warm as he crossed the room to her. The artist herself. Before Eliza could form a coherent thought, let alone words, a woman in a sleek black dress approached, extending a hand. "Ms. Morgan, your work is extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying the faint traces of a French accent. "The emotional depth, the technical skill. Thomas was right about you." Eliza shook the woman's hand automatically, her mind still struggling to process the transformation of her apartment. "I'm sorry, I don't—" "Eliza," Thomas said gently, guiding her fully into the apartment and closing the door behind her. "Allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Thomas Harrington, founder of the Harrington Gallery and the Harrington Foundation for the Arts." The name registered dimly in Eliza's stunned mind. The Harrington Gallery was one of the most prestigious in New York, known for launching careers and holding a collection that rivaled many museums. "You're—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't reconcile the homeless man who'd shared her couch with the influential art collector now standing before her. "I owe you an explanation," Thomas said, his expression apologetic, "and I'll provide one. But first," he gestured to the gathered crowd, "these people came to see your work. And they're not just looking. 3 pieces have already sold." The words penetrated Eliza's shock like distant thunder. "Sold?" she repeated numbly. "Indeed." The woman in black nodded. "I've purchased the blue abstract myself. It will be perfect for my client's new Tribeca loft." Eliza looked around the room with new awareness, noticing the small red dots that had been affixed beside several paintings. Sold. Her work. The pieces galleries had rejected, the emotional outpourings she'd hidden away. People wanted them, were buying them. The reality of the situation began to sink in, bringing with it a wave of conflicting emotions. Gratitude and anger, joy and betrayal, hope and suspicion all crashed together in her chest. "May I have a moment with Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Alone." The woman nodded understandingly and moved away. Thomas guided Eliza to the small bathroom, the only private space in the apartment, and closed the door behind them. "You lied to me," Eliza said, the words coming out in a rush now that they were alone. "You pretended to be homeless, you let me think—" "I never said I was homeless," Thomas interrupted gently. "I was simply in the park. You made assumptions, which I allowed." He sighed, running a hand through his now neat hair. "The truth is complicated, Eliza." "Try me," she said, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Thomas leaned against the sink, suddenly looking tired despite his elegant attire. "6 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease," he said quietly. "The prognosis is good, but the diagnosis— it affected me more deeply than I anticipated. I've spent my life surrounded by beauty, by art that speaks to the core of human experience. Suddenly facing my own mortality, I found myself questioning everything: my work, my purpose, what legacy I would leave." Eliza's anger faltered in the face of his vulnerability. "I started walking," Thomas continued. "Long walks through the city, away from the galleries and auction houses, away from the constant demands of the art world. I'd sit in parks watching people, thinking, and somewhere along the way, I realized I'd lost touch with why I fell in love with art in the first place, its raw honesty, its ability to make us feel deeply." He met her eyes directly. "Then yesterday, a young artist shared her lunch with me, not because of my name or my gallery or my collection, but simply out of kindness. And when she showed me her work that embodied everything I'd been missing, it felt like coming home." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Eliza felt her anger begin to dissolve, replaced by a complex mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. "So you decided to turn my apartment into a pop-up gallery without asking?" she asked, but the edge had left her voice. Thomas had the grace to look sheepish. "An impulsive decision, I admit. After you left for work, I made some calls. These people—" He gestured toward the door, indicating the gathering beyond, "are collectors, gallery owners, critics I've known for years. People who appreciate authentic art, who are willing to invest in emerging talents. I wanted them to see your work as I saw it, in its natural environment, created by someone who paints from necessity, not for the market." "You should have asked," Eliza said, but she could feel her resistance crumbling in the face of his explanation. "You're right," Thomas agreed readily. "And I apologize for the deception." "But Eliza—" He took her hand, his touch gentle. "Your work deserves to be seen, not just by me, but by people who can appreciate its value, who can help build the career you deserve." Eliza looked down at their joined hands, noting the slight tremor in his, a symptom of the condition he'd just revealed. The realization that Thomas had shared his own vulnerability, his own closely held secret, softened something in her chest. 3 pieces sold? She asked, still struggling to believe it. Thomas's face brightened. So far? And there's interest in several others. Camille, the woman in black, she's from Galerie Lumière. They're looking for new American artists for a show next spring. He squeezed her hand. This could be just the beginning, Eliza. The possibility unfurled before her like a road suddenly illuminated after a long journey in darkness. A chance, a real chance, to live as the artist she'd always dreamed of becoming. I'm still mad at you, she said, but a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Completely understandable, Thomas replied, his own smile matching hers. Perhaps you'll allow me to make it up to you. A proper dinner for starters, a significant upgrade from canned soup and stale bread. Eliza laughed despite herself. I should at least go out there and meet these people who are buying my art, shouldn't I? Absolutely. Thomas opened the bathroom door with a flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the waiting crowd, allow me to properly introduce you to Eliza Morgan, whose work you've been admiring. I guarantee you'll be seeing much more of her in the coming years. The evening that followed was surreal, a dream Eliza kept expecting to wake from. She moved through her transformed apartment in a daze, accepting compliments and business cards, watching as more red dots appeared beside her paintings. Thomas remained at her side, a steadying presence, introducing her to people whose names she'd only read in art magazines. By the time the last guest departed, Eliza's head was spinning with possibilities, a potential show at a Soho gallery, an invitation to submit work for a prestigious annual exhibition, even a tentative discussion about a residency program sponsored by the Harrington Foundation. As the door closed behind the final visitor, Eliza leaned against it, exhaustion and elation battling for dominance. Her apartment, though still recognizably hers, seemed transformed, not just by the professional lighting that remained or the empty wine glasses scattered on surfaces, but by the new way she viewed her own work displayed on the walls. How are you feeling? Thomas asked, loosening his tie as he sank onto the couch, the same couch where he'd slept the night before, appearing for all the world like a man with nowhere else to go. I don't know, Eliza answered honestly. Like I'm dreaming. Like I'm going to wake up tomorrow and find none of this happened. Thomas smiled. It happened. And it's just the beginning. He gestured to the small stack of business cards on her kitchen counter. Those people don't offer opportunities lightly. They saw what I saw. Genuine talent, authentic vision. Why me? The question had been building all evening. Of all the struggling artists in New York, why did you choose to help me? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights twinkled beyond the glass. Because you saw me, he said finally. Not Thomas Harrington the collector or gallery owner, but just me, a man sitting alone in a park. He looked back at her, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. And because your art speaks the truth. In a world full of noise and pretension, that's rarer than you might think. The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep in Eliza's heart. In sharing her lunch, she'd never imagined she was setting in motion a chain of events that would transform her life. Yet here she was, standing in an apartment where her paintings, her expressions of joy and pain and longing, had been valued not just with words, but with actions. What happens now? She asked softly. Thomas stood, crossing to where she still leaned against the door. Now you keep painting. You keep creating honest, powerful work. And he smiled, a warm, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I keep my promise about dinner. A celebration seems in order, don't you think? Eliza laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of joy she'd almost forgotten existed. I think I can manage that. As they left the apartment, stepping out into the cool night air, Eliza felt something shift inside her. A burden lifting, a new path opening. The struggles weren't over. One night of success didn't erase the challenges of building an artistic career, but for the first time in years, possibility outweighed doubt. And it had all begun with a simple turkey sandwich, shared with a stranger in a park. 6 months later, Eliza stood in the crowded main room of the Harrington Gallery, barely recognizing herself in the reflection of the large windows. The woman in the elegant but simple black dress, hair styled in soft waves, a glass of champagne held loosely in one hand, this poised, confident artist was a far cry from the desperate young woman who had once shared her meager lunch with a man she thought was homeless. Around her, the walls displayed her first solo exhibition. 20 large canvases that represented the culmination of months of intensive work. Some were pieces she'd created before meeting Thomas, ones he'd discovered during that impromptu showing in her apartment. Others were new, painted in the light of new confidence, new purpose. "There you are," Thomas's voice came from behind her. He moved to stand beside her, his own reflection joining hers in the window. The tremor in his hands had progressed slightly over the months, but treatment was helping, and his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence, the same appreciation for beauty that had drawn her to him that first day. "Just taking a moment," Eliza said, smiling at him in the reflection. "It's overwhelming. In a good way, I hope." Thomas's shoulder brushed against hers, a gesture of reassurance that had become familiar over their months of friendship. "The best way." Eliza turned to face the room, taking in the crowd of art lovers, critics, collectors, and friends who had come to celebrate her work. "I never thought—" "I know," Thomas followed her gaze. "But I did. From the moment I saw that first painting in your portfolio." Their relationship had evolved in unexpected ways since that fateful day in the park. Thomas had become mentor, friend, champion of her work, and lately, perhaps something more, something neither had put into words yet, but which hummed between them like a current, warm and full of possibility. "You changed my life," Eliza said softly. "With that one conversation in the park." Thomas's smile held a hint of mischief. "As I recall, you're the one who approached me. You changed your own life, Eliza, when you chose kindness over indifference. I merely opened a door." A gallery assistant approached, apologetically interrupting. "Ms. Morgan, the Times critic would like a few moments of your time if you're available." "Of course," Eliza said, straightening her shoulders. She handed her champagne glass to Thomas. "Duty calls. Go," he encouraged. "Your public awaits." As Eliza moved through the gallery, stopping to discuss her work with interested parties, answering questions about her technique and inspiration, she caught glimpses of Thomas watching her from across the room, pride evident in his expression. How strange life was, how unexpected its turnings. A simple act of compassion had led here to this moment of triumph, of dreams realized. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the gallery staff had begun the process of closing up, Eliza and Thomas stood alone before her largest canvas, the centerpiece of the exhibition. Titled Shared Lunch, it depicted two figures seated beneath a bare oak tree, sharing a simple meal. The background a swirl of blues and gold suggesting both hardship and hope. "It's my favorite," Thomas said quietly. The moment everything changed, Eliza leaned against him slightly, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "For both of us, I think." Thomas nodded, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining with natural ease. "I went to the park that day feeling lost, questioning everything about my life's work. Then a kind young woman shared her lunch, and later her art, and reminded me why beauty matters, why connection matters. And I went home that night with a mysterious homeless man who turned out to be a famous art collector," Eliza teased gently, squeezing his hand. Thomas laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet gallery. "Life never follows the expected path, does it?" "Thank goodness for that," Eliza replied, turning to face him fully. "I've learned to appreciate the unexpected." In the soft gallery lighting, surrounded by her art, expressions of her deepest self, Eliza felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The struggling artist who had once shared her lunch out of simple human kindness now stood on the threshold of the career she'd always dreamed of, beside a man who saw her, truly saw her, both as an artist and as a person. And it had all begun with a sandwich, broken in half and offered without expectation, a simple act that had somehow contained the seeds of transformation for them both. "What next?" Thomas asked, echoing the question she'd posed that night in her apartment when everything had just begun to change. Eliza smiled, feeling the future unfurl before them like a blank canvas, waiting for the first brushstroke. "We keep creating," she said. "We keep sharing. We keep finding beauty in unexpected places." "Together?" Thomas asked, his voice holding a question more profound than the single word suggested. Eliza's answer was a simple squeeze of his hand, a gesture as small but significant as sharing a sandwich with a stranger, a beginning disguised as an ordinary moment, containing within it all the transformative power of connection, of kindness, of love. "Together," she confirmed, and in that word was a promise, a future, a story still unfolding, one brushstroke, one shared meal, one act of kindness at a time.